Next up, let me grab that. Next up, I'm going to introduce our, what are we calling you? I guess it's the research data.
I'm a mad scientist.
Yes, well, I'll stick with that. So Dr. John Christoph, been a rail advocate for a long time, but also a geoscientist. And he has been helping us with our data and research team. I like mad scientists, though. I think I'm going to stick with that. But we've been talking on and off this year about some of the work that we're doing as a research team, which I've been pretty deeply involved in, partly because I enjoy it, but also we needed it to get done. And John has really kind of taken the leadership role in there. And so we have, I've been knee deep in it, but Joe Aiello back there, who had scientists behind all the gear, but his graduate work is also in this field, and so we really have been working very hard on the research side, and we found some interesting things along the way, and I wanted John to share them with all of you. So I'm going to turn this over to John, and I'm not sticking with mad scientist. I don't know what it's going to be, but
you ready to?
There you go.
All right. Does our sound and slide advance work? Okay. So for the 45, 50, 60 minutes or so, we're going to talk about some data. You might be asking sort of why would Jim invite a mad scientist to be the guy speaking of rail people? The answer is I'm not the only person involved with this. As much as you like to think, this has been a team effort by a lot of folks, not just in our association, but with a lot of our partner organizations. And so before I get into the weeds of the thing, unfortunately, I throw way too many animations. So unless this button works, there we go. So yeah, team that we've assembled is not just members, it's a bunch of people in a bunch of organizations that we have worked together with on this, but a few are worth mentioning. Dan Bilka, Mike Christensen, and myself were really the three key volunteers that started this process about 2 years ago, really getting the ball rolling with COVID, building the team back up again, restarting the work that had been started in 2016 with our university partners, University of Southern Mississippi. And we put in a lot, and we still couldn't get enough of it done. So we had to get some extra help. Our three interns this summer, Maxwell Middleton, Maximilian Polens, and Rivka Kadim, have been invaluable. I'm going to point out these specific places which these three talented students has put their mark on this project when we get into part 3. There's also a few other students. I wound up needing more help even that, so I roped in some of my GW students, and 2 of them, Cecilia Paparella and Elizabeth Hartmetz, really stepped up to the plate to help us get the data analyzed. Cecilia wound up doing her senior capstone project with me as her minor in sustainability. She now works at NASA, so she doesn't have time to do this anymore. But you can't do it without people who eventually go work to NASA. And I also want to point out every single person on the RPA staff has helped with this, not even just at some degree. This could not have happened without John C. and Joe and Sean and every other person who the association brings on to help get everything done. You can't have a research team without an organization that backs it, and our organization is backed by some of the best people in the business. So I want to give them a round of applause, first of all. So what the heck about? I like to focus on some stuff that has happened since COVID with 3 groups that have really been the key supporters of this work. The Sally Mead Hands Foundation, which gave us a venue to study the entire Amtrak national network in one fell swoop. Main Rail Group and Train Narratives Northeast have brought us on to study a corridor they're proposing for a Downeaster extension. And then most recently, Transportation for America, John Roberts and friends brought us a big problem in this summer that was urgent and needed doing. And we took time out of our way to do it because we're friends, but also because it's important work. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about towards the end of this. So the other point, though, is that this isn't just a celebration or a say thanks to all the people who helped, but a lot of folks here, hey, RPA is doing research. We have a modeling project that we're working on. What is that? What are we doing here? I thought this was an association of people who like to ride trains. We're not a think tank. Friends, we're also a think tank. What we do is 3 steps. We have a piece of computational software that we have developed ourselves in partnership with the University of Southern Mississippi that enables us to predict future ridership for routes that don't exist. Using this tech of a gravity or predicting demand between center A and center B, we use census data. We look at the demographics and geographic characteristics of counties in the United States and counties we have where one people are likely to use that train. Economic impact of the riders at that station. And put out there, we use and there are many others out there like it, and we'll see several over the course of this talk. And most recently, quantify the environmental impact of riding the train. What does it mean to get people out of cars and onto train in a way that not just with an idealized notion of we can decarbonize in the future, but what is the tangible economic benefit of environmental? So let's get through this. I'm already wasting 5 minutes. So we're going to try and speed run this a little bit. Buckle up. Is that better? There we go. Thank you, Harvey. All right. So let's take this one step at a time. Part 1, we're going to talk about how we predict ridership and what we mean by that. So the geographic and demographic data that we have available from the US Census is vast. If you have not gone into the census database and looked for all the different ways they can count people, you would not believe it. So we have a list of 36 different population and demographic variables that we press the button several times to get to appear. Thank you, Joe. So we have set 36 different variables that our folks at the University of Southern Mississippi analyzed for us. They did a whole bunch of different correlation analyses to figure how many of these variables correspond with Amtrak ridership across 4 different categories: demographics, industrial, land and natural resources ideas, and then travel demand statistics. Here's a list of every single one of them. I do not expect you to read this. This will not be on the test. But just to give you a slice of what things we have looked at. So for demographics, we're thinking about things like the population over 65 in a county. How many of those people are disabled? How many of them are enrolled in higher education? Things where I've heard so many people say they have an intuition that if you have lots of students at universities in a county, that might generate lots of Amtrak ridership. But there are also things here that you might not expect. So for example, we have looked at the demographics by race and socioeconomic status, not because we expect that certain groups of people are more likely to take the train than others, but because we want to make sure that as we're doing our correlation analyses, we are fully accounting for everything that might show up. It turns out there is not a statistically significant correlation between any racial demographic group the census defines and Amtrak ridership. Everyone rides trains, which is what you'd expect. It's nice to be able to say that quantitatively, everyone rides trains, as you'd expect. And then the same things for going down through this list. Some ones I want to point out, though, that may be a little unintuitive. Minimum annual temperature in the land and nature category. What that means is the colder it gets in winter, the more people will ride the train. You might wonder why, until you remember that the train can run when there's 12 inches of snow on the ground, and you cannot drive in that unless your DOT is real good at plowing the roads. I'm not so sure that every DOT is as good at plowing the roads as the folks in Virginia were growing up, and even then, Virginia doesn't get much snow. And then in travel category, things like car-free households, walking and biking commuters, the things the urbanists love to talk about. When you have cities where people can move around by other means besides cars, they might be more likely to take a train. You'd be surprised at how much for intercity travel that doesn't matter. It does not matter if you're in a big city or a small town. It does not matter if you have a concentrated metro area or a relatively dispersed number of smaller towns. The catchment area for intercity transportation is so vast that people will go out of their way to a train station to take a trip, even if that adds another hour onto their trip. Even in cases where that hour onto the trip might be lengthening their total travel time. As in, not intuitive as that may be, we see it show up in our data as a unique feature of intercity rail that is not applicable for urban transit. So what do we find? Well, these are the correlations that our folks at USM gave us in terms of how to scale the key variables that show up here. You'll notice all 36 are not present. These are the ones that matter at a statistically significant level. A whole bunch of them just don't apply. And it's things like median household income. You'll see a real large number of zeros there. That's because median household income is measured in tens of thousands of dollars rather than on a scale of 0 to 1 as a percentage. So your scale factor has to be a smaller number, but that tells you got 0.1378 as a factor in the same way that you've got 0.461 as a factor for number of stations. Is it surprising to you that the number of Amtrak stations in a county is the primary determinant of will people use the train in that county? What a concept! If you have a train, people will use it. So we can talk about this till the cows come home, but here's the thing. I get asked more often than any other question about this. Well, actually, no, I should, first of all, I'm going to skip through this bit briefly. This is the results that we got from the same study for the folks in Maine. The blue counties that you see highlighted there are where the current Downeaster runs. The pink counties and the line that you see connecting them are the proposed service that the Maine Rail Group and Train Riders Northeast want to send to Orono, which is this town that hosts the University of Maine campus. We're predicting you're going to get something like a 50% increase in ridership over the current Downeaster by just having 2 trains a day go on that branch extension up to Orono and have the remainder continue to Brunswick. So those 2 trains would be overperforming as compared to their total capacity and the proportional capacity that they carry. And looking even at all of the counties that will not receive a new train station, every single one of those 10 counties still sees thousands of people every year showing up to one of the train stations that we're building new to ride the train. And they're going out of their way to do so because the only way they have is with driving in rural buses. So this matters for the entire country, and it matters beyond the scope of where we might have new stations at the local level. But we still have this sort of overhanging sort of idea, right? Why is it 2 trains a day? Why couldn't we run all 5 Downeasters up to Orono? Why would we maybe want to have it be so limited in terms of how we decide whether it's going to be the morning train or the evening train? Midday trains are a thing. We need those, right? So what about frequency? I get asked this more often than anything else. I had a conversation with the folks at the Routes and Schedules Committee where we were thinking about where might we try to apply this model earlier in the year. And I heard very loud and clear Steve Musin said, it'd be real nice if our model could predict how ridership responds to how many trains come in a given day. We had to talk with the folks at ESPA about using this model to predict how ridership might happen on a future extension of the Empire service. And Steve Strauss told me loud and clear, it'd be real nice if our model could predict the frequency correlation with how trains would ridership would happen. And then at a Virginia Rail board meeting, I asked, would anybody be interested in applying this in Virginia? And Meredith Richards said, it'd be real nice if we had a model that could predict how ridership depends upon frequency. You don't have to tell me 3 times a good idea, but Meredith offered something interesting in addition. Meredith said, and this is as close as I can remember to a direct quote, so remember if I said this wrong, Meredith, but if you look at Virginia's ridership data on the state-supported services, once you hit 3 trains a day, ridership really starts to take off. That is a testable hypothesis. I don't need to be told twice to go find a testable hypothesis, so here is the data. What you see here is a blob of dots. We're going to think about how to interpret this blob of dots in a little bit more detail. We're going to walk through this. On the horizontal axis of the plot, you'll notice station ridership. That is how many people ride the train at each station. On the vertical axis, the population of the area around that station at the county level. Each of those dots is a station somewhere on the Amtrak system. They're color-coded. The purple dots get 3 trains a week. That's the Cardinal and the Sunset Limited, and only those stations where the only train is the Cardinal and the Sunset Limited. So it doesn't count Chicago, it doesn't count DC, it doesn't count Los Angeles. The blue dots in the chart, slightly darker shade, are the daily long-distance services where that's the only train. And then you have 2 trains a day, 3 trains a day, up to 6 trains a day as you go closer through the rainbow to red. You might notice if you look carefully, the range on the vertical axis is all pretty consistent. The highest ridership station is a 3-day-a-week station. Or rather, rephrase that. The highest population station is a 3 days a week station. The lowest population station is also a 3-day-a-week station. That tells you that we're relying on the Cardinal and the Sunset Limited for a lot of people that could probably use more service. We are going to be thinking more about that in a second. But what it also tells you is that frequency does not necessarily align with population. More populated places do not necessarily get more trains. That seems sensible. But if you look carefully, the purple dots are all concentrated on the left, and they get more red as you go to the right. And the blue stuff is right there in the middle. What that tells you is that as frequency increases, ridership seems to increase along with it. So I showed this plot to a few other folks in the association and asked for their feedback before I presented it. Dino Drudy piped up and said, "Hey, John, could you show the correlation coefficients?" And I said, "Dino, don't make me do extra work. The correlation coefficients don't tell you very much." And he said, "Yeah, but come on. I want to see the correlation coefficients." Okay, Dino, here you go. Those are the R-squared values. I apologize for the font size. I thought that would be a little bit bigger on the screen, but what you'll notice is that for the lower frequency things, it's all in the 0.4, 0.3 range. To interpret R-squared values, here's how to think about it. R-squared represents the percentage of the variation in one data set that can be explained by variation in another data set. So 30% of the ridership variation at daily service stations can be explained by the population of the service area of those stations. Only 30%. That means other variables need to come in to explain all of that. Maybe like those geographic and demographic stuff we spent so much time talking about too, right? But this is an important point actually, and I'm glad Dino asked me to put this in here because those two red dots on the very far right side of the screen, there's one around 100,000 people and one around 1 million people. Those two dots are Boston North Station and Seattle, Washington. If I remove Boston North Station from the 5 trains a day data set, the correlation coefficient jumps from its current 0.4 value to 0.95. If I instead remove Seattle, the correlation coefficient drops to 0.14. This is called p-hacking. If you have heard about the reproducibility crisis in scientific literature, you may be familiar with the term p-hacking. They don't use R-squared, they use p, different measure of a similar quantity. But this is the important thing. You cannot just rely on correlation coefficients to tell you how one thing relates to another. You have to get into the causal links between them. And for that, you can't just look at dots. So let's look at the distributions of this data. We're going to do some normal distribution analyses here. You may have seen normal distributions as a bell curve. We're going to show you something a bit more easy to look at. This is a cumulative normal distribution. This doesn't tell you the probability that a given data point will have a certain value. It tells you how it tells you the probability that a data point will have at least a certain value. So your scale goes from 0 to 1 rather than from 0 to some arbitrary percentage. Makes it a little easier to plot on one chart when you have multiple data sets with multiple sizes. Notice the color coordinating is the same. The purple line is way off to the left. And as you step up each level of frequency, you move progressively further to the left until you get to 3 trains a day. At 3 trains a day, that line overlaps, at least for a certain portion of the curve, with 4, 5, and 6 train a day curves. You might gather then that what that means is that once you hit 3 trains a day, ridership really starts to take off, like Meredith supposed originally. I am going to propose a different interpretation, though, because what this shows you is that ridership is actually pretty consistent across the 4, 5, and 6 train data sets. What this is showing you is that at less than 3 trains a day, you are leaving riders on the table. There are people who could ride the train who are not riding the train because it comes at the wrong time. And they have to adjust their schedules according to the timetable of the service, rather than having the freedom to decide when they can travel best that meets their needs. You might look at that and say, okay, but how do you factor in the population differences? How come Alpine, Texas and Houston, Texas are on the same curve? Surely it matters that Houston, Texas has 5 million people and Alpine has a couple thousand. Here's that same exact plot, but now populations on the horizontal axis. Notice that every single one of those curves lies on top of each other. That tells you that population does not make a difference. If every single curve for every single frequency distribution is lying on top of each other, the variable on the horizontal axis holds no explanatory power. Population does not matter. If you take people from a place with people to a place with other people, and you have a train that takes them there, they'll use it. Doesn't matter if it's a town of 5,000 or a city of 5 million. They're going to use it just as much. So, okay, could we then think one step further? Think about when the train comes. This gets seductive, but for a couple of reasons I'll articulate in a second, it's a trap. You should not be worrying about this, right? It'd be so tempting to be able to predict a timetable just from demographic data, be able to say when on the clock face your train should come to get the most possible riders. No, just don't. Just please don't make me do this. I've got a bonus slide where I put that blob onto a time normalized weighted average, and you can see how in the evening your ridership is low, and in the midday ridership is high. And that appears to make sense, but it's a trap. This raw data here is chaos. This is plotted every single long distance train and every single one of the corridor trains that comes once per day. And you'll notice that they have no relationship whatsoever unless you really massage this data set. You might not have a clear intuition as to why it doesn't matter when the train comes. Why are there some stations that perform as well in the middle of the night as there are that perform at high noon? I think the best way to illustrate this is to look at specific routes. Let's look at 6. The first off are the California Zephyr and the Empire Builder. The color scale for this chart has green for trains that are going east and north, and blue for trains that are going west and south. The points you see there are not lined up by timetable because these trains both take more than one day to get from origin to destination. They're lined up by when the train comes. So you'll see that there is this nice trend where in the middle of the day, both trains seem to have a little bit higher ridership in the aggregate than they do in the middle of the night, but that's not uniformly true across the entire clock face. Still, though, you can almost make out the trend you expect. These are the only 2 routes in the entire Amtrak network for which that is true. Every other route does something different, something weird. Welcome to the eldritch horror that is timetabling. Our next 2 are the Coast Starlight and the Texas Eagle. Notice how on the Coast Starlight, every single station has the same ridership per capita value, one of 2. It's either just above 0.2 riders per capita or just above 0.02 riders per capita, an order of magnitude difference. It might make sense to you that Salinas gets 10 times more riders than Dunsmuir. It should not make sense that every station on the Coast Starlight that only receives the Coast Starlight every day behaves either like Salinas or like Dunsmuir. There should be some intermediate things. There should be some stations where there's higher or lower ridership. There aren't. What's going on? And then this Texas Eagle. Look at that lovely little mirror plane that shows up right about 2 o'clock p.m. as the southbound train stops at all the same stations. The northbound train is about to stop at, and they have the exact same ridership per capita values, but in the reverse direction. That little heartbeat swirl that you see there from 8 a.m. going up on the 21, I think it is, and then the southbound 22, same thing. Yeah. Why is there that symmetry there? Why do you have a bimodal distribution in your data set? Maybe it's like, I don't know, geography matters more than timetable and predicting how many people are going to ride a train at a given station, like we said before. What about it? And then let's think about the Southwest Chief in the city of New Orleans. What is going on here? The Southwest Chief ridership from a period around 4 p.m. to a period around 5 a.m. oscillates between sky high and rock bottom faster than Jimi Hendrix composing a masterpiece. And then the city of New Orleans. Why does the city of New Orleans perform better in the middle of the night than it does in midday? Why does New Bern and Dyersburg, Tennessee have that high riders per capita at 3 o'clock in the morning? Do people just want to leave New Bern, Dyersburg, Tennessee at 3 o'clock in the morning? I can't explain it, and neither can you. So let's takeaways from ridership. Frequency less than 3 trains a day leaves ridership unserved. But when the train comes matters less than you think. I would argue this is actually a good thing, because if it was true that every single train should stop at every single station at noon for the maximum ridership in that spot, you would never make a timetable. You have the flexibility here to be able to say that running 3 trains a day is about where you should be to maximize your service level for a route, but you don't need to go that far down into the weeds and say that if it comes at 4 o'clock, it'll be better than if it comes at 5 o'clock. Great. That makes our lives as advocates so much easier. I cannot tell you how hard it is to argue about timetables with people who do not care about timetables. But more importantly, if you really want a good ridership prediction, all of this discussion about frequency really validates the original approach RPA took 10 years ago. You want to look at who is most likely to take a train and then look at where they're traveling and not worry so much about all of the pieces that urban planning professionals love to think about for urban transit and not worry so much about all of the nitpicky little crannies of things that rail nerds love to think about. This is a demographic and geographic problem. You can do this with census data, and you will get predictions that are more than adequate for the early stages of service provision that advocates are pushing for. Okay, but when you're doing the advocacy, people don't really care about ridership. Like, it ultimately does not matter to the mayor of Des Moines, Iowa, how many people would ride the Quad Cities rocket if it came to Des Moines, Iowa. What that guy cares about is the economic impact of that train. How many people would that train bring to their area, and what would those people do when they get there? So, hey, what do passengers do on a train trip? Like, when you get off at a station, what do you do? Yeah, you get food and other things. You might go shopping. You might get food. You go out to a sporting event or a concert or something. You maybe spend the night in a hotel if it's a multi-day trip, and maybe you need additional transportation like a taxi or a ride hail or an e-bike or something to get from where your station is to where you're trying to get to. All of that stuff costs money. And all of the states keep track of how much tourist visitors to their states spend money on their visits. So Dan Bilka and Mike Christensen and I trolled the databases of every single one of the 50 states in our great union to find those data on how tourists spend money in each state. And we came up with a list of every single one of them. Here are some overview statistics that represent the sample. There are a few states like West Virginia where folks might be expected to spend only a few dollars on a given visit because cost of living is cheap and services are easy to find. But then you get to states where it costs hundreds of dollars for a single item on a given visit. For those y'all who are keeping track of your budgets for this trip, think about how much you're spending on your hotel and your restaurants and everything you're spending money on for this train trip here to San Antonio, or this plane trip if you feel like me, because I don't have the time for a 3-day trip from DC. I'm sorry. So that's useful because once we have a ridership prediction, you can plug those numbers in and be able to say how many people are visiting among that ridership pool and what will they spend money on. That gets us to implant. This is the core piece of what we do. This is what the capabilities that RPA can provide uniquely. Not that implant is something we only have access to. It's used by everybody. But what we do is we can take that ridership number and plug it into this. What is this? This is a transaction simulator. Let's suppose that you have one passenger, they get off a train somewhere, they buy a meal at a restaurant. That restaurant has employees, and those employees earn a salary or a wage or get tips or whatever. There's some amount of labor that that transaction is compensating for. The additional value of the meal is then the added value that goes to the passenger. We can think about these three quantities over the course of any transaction that not occurs for buying a meal, staying at a hotel, going to see a show, you name it. But that's just the direct impact of that passenger showing up in town. You can also think about everything that had to happen before that passenger got there to let that transaction take place. You might think about the restaurant owner renting out space in a commercial building, hiring those workers in the first place and keeping them on staff for days or weeks or months before the passenger arrives. But let's just keep it simple and focus on the ingredients the restaurant has to purchase to make the meal. Those ingredients come from some supplier who has workers who earn a salary or a wage. And there is an added value of those ingredients to the restaurant by enabling them to run its business. So you have an indirect impact that comes along with the original restaurant transaction. And going forward, you can also think about what the restaurant will do with their profits. Maybe they'll invest in new furnishings to spruce up their space a bit, hang some new curtains, buy some new cutlery. There's a person out there who had to make those furnishings and supply them to the restaurant. They earn a salary or a wage or something. And there is added value of those furnishings to the restaurant that endures after the transaction by this one passenger as an induced impact. These three terms are going to be important to bear in mind because we can isolate the direct and indirect and induced impacts from each other and then add them all up to think about the total impact of each individual dollar that every passenger injects into the economy of the places they take a train to. And we can then plot that out for any given county level jurisdiction that you'd like us to cover. These are the 4 counties that our Maine Rail Group friends proposed stations would be located in Maine on their expansion. The solid portion of the bar graph there shows you the direct impact of spending on shopping, dining, entertainment, lodging, and transportation. And there's a further hollow portion of the graph above that, which represents the induced and indirect impacts. The total spending is at the very top of those bars. And you'll notice that this is measured in $300,000 per passenger, $300,000 per county increments, right? And that's just for the 4 counties that'll get new stations. It doesn't even show you the impact for those stations that already exist on the Downeaster or the rest of the Amtrak network that it connects to. But we can do that with some maps here. The darker the green you see here, the more money is being spent in those counties, with the direct impact on the left and the statewide total impact on the right. I had to futz with the color scheme a little bit because it turns out that a lot of people really want to go to Portland. If I had this all in one chart, every single one of those green county labels would be very close to white, except for Portland, which would be the darkest green on the screen. So we've rescaled a little bit. Notice how Cumberland County gives you $5.8 million in direct impact from those 300,000 new riders, and the whole state gets $9.8 million in direct impact. And when you extrapolate that into the additional realm of the induced and indirect spending, you're talking about $15.5 million of economic activity that will happen because this train runs. 2 trains a day, serving 6 stations, puts $15.5 million into the Maine economy. That's pretty huge. This is the kind of argument that can convince a legislator to go from being skeptical of a rail expansion plan to vehemently supporting it, voting for it, making this thing happen. We got within 1 vote of this corridor getting corridor ID funding from the Maine legislature. The only reason we didn't was because of a parliamentary error, but it comes back into the pipeline of the next session, and you've been working on that, haven't you, Jim? There's a long story there, which we'll get into another time. But point being, this is where you really convincing data for people who care about the economy of a given region for a given route. But we can also do the same thing for the entire country. This is the impact that you will usually see for the national network long-distance trains. We almost exclusively think about the operating cost and how much fare revenue Amtrak brings in. This is the old argument that every single person in this room is tired of, that Amtrak's long-distance trains lose money, and therefore we should not be funding them. You've heard this so many times. It's so tiring. What are those passengers going to do when they get to their stations? Well, they're going to more than offset the cost of operating those trains just with their direct spending. Every single route on the national network has more direct impact in the community than it costs to run, with one exception, and that exception is the Southwest Chief. Again, I can't explain the Southwest Chief. But note the Silver services, bringing in for the Silver Meteor nearly 2 times, and for the Silver Star, nearly 3 times as much direct spending in the cities and towns they serve as they cost to operate. You can only imagine that the indirect impact and the induced impact are going to compound on top of that, and you'd be right. Look at that chart. The total impact in the dark blue dwarfs the operating costs of the train in the pink on the left. And it consistently holds for every single long-distance train. I think we can officially retire the argument that Amtrak trains lose money and don't serve the communities well. It clearly is the case that they do. And we can prove it with the modeling software that RPA has to offer. But then the flip side of the argument is, well, what about the Northeast Corridor? Like, surely if these routes are performing so well, we don't need the Northeast Corridor to sponsor the whole system, right? Well, here's what the Northeast Corridor does. We're going to simplify the chart a little bit and think about 2 terms from the railroading industry and the policy sector. If you are in the railroad space and you've heard the term operating ratio, you might cringe a little bit. Operating ratio is just your difference or ratio between how much money it costs to operate the train and how much revenue it brings in. The freight train companies love to maximize that stat to no end, and it's why they have been losing carload service in favor of intermodal, bulk commodities, and coal for the entire time I have been alive. It is ruining the freight rail industry, and it is ruining the Amtrak system as well every single time someone suggests that Amtrak's operating ratio does not justify its existence. In public policy, we tend to use something called the multiplier effect instead. The multiplier effect represents how many dollars go into an economic system as a result of a given public sector spending project. The typical sort of context for multiplier effect is that most county level public projects have a multiplier effect somewhere between 1 and 2. State level projects typically are around 2, 2.5, and federal projects are usually around 4. But there are some notable exceptions to that. The space program, NASA, famously has a multiplier effect of around 7.5. The Northeast Corridor blows that out of the water with a multiplier effect of 8.1. The Northeast Corridor provides a comparable direct benefit to the states that it runs through as the entire National Aeronautics and Space Administration has for the entire United States. And every single one of the long distance routes comes pretty damn close to the public education system, which has a multiplier effect of around 4.1. The Acela has a smaller multiplier effect than the Silver Star. Where do we want to invest trains? We got to be firing on all cylinders. We need high frequency corridor services for the places with high demand. We need high speed services for the places where we need high speed. And we need long distance services for the places that need rural connectivity to places that are far afield. Every single one of those modes will give you a multiplier effect benefit far out of proportion to how much it costs to run them. But that's not all. Because of that high multiplier effect, we can also break this down by state as well as by Amtrak route, and this divides that effect in the state by the population of that state to basically calculate how many dollars does Amtrak put back in your pocket by virtue of existing, whether or not you have ridden a train in the last year or not. In 2024, the average American is $6.47 wealthier because Amtrak exists. That's pretty good, right? There are a few things you might notice here. For example, South Dakota and Wyoming aren't shown because they don't have Amtrak trains. Oklahoma and Michigan and the New England states are also missing because they only have state-sponsored corridor services. This is just the long-distance network. This isn't even getting into the state-sponsored corridors or the Northeast Corridor. We could make smaller maps for each of those regions showing how those states in particular benefit from their state-level investments. And here's what the Northeast Corridors look like. Hundreds of dollars coming back into the pocket of every single Pennsylvanian and New Yorker and Massachusetts resident and Marylander as a result of the Northeast Corridor existing, regardless whether they took a train or not. Being as I am from the DC area, I'll just note, I didn't put this up yet. DC is a little small on that map, but you'll notice it's dark. $1,551.10 per resident. Every single one of DC's 702,500 residents is that much better off in 2024 because people take the train to Washington, D.C. and spend money in our city when they arrive. I put this up here not to illustrate some point about how D.C. is disproportionately benefiting from a national network priority, but rather, D.C. is the only state-level jurisdiction in the U.S. that gives you city-like characteristics across its entire area. You can imagine that in all of the cities Amtrak serves, the impact is closer to what the state-level impact of DC is. Houston probably gets quite a bit more than the few dollars that every Texan would get because Houston gets service 3 times a week. Still probably not as high as Northeast Corridor service because it's 3 times a week, but it ain't nothing either. And the impacts get concentrated in the communities that the train serves. That's the thing to illustrate here. But again, we're only talking here about the spending impact, what passengers do with their money. That's not even the total economic impact of Amtrak. There's so much else going on here. Every single trip that is taken on Amtrak represents a trip that could have been taken by some other mode, and the passenger chose to take the train. By choosing to take the train instead of driving, for example, they are saving the state highway department's money in road maintenance, in insurance against accidents, in the costs of driving itself in the form of vehicle insurance and motor fuel that is paid by the passenger. You get tax revenue as a result of all of the spending that has happened in all of these jurisdictions, and also because that revenue burden on the state highway departments is lessened when you have people switching from road to rail. And then finally, there's this next little pink column there called reduce pollution. We have a whole chapter on reduce pollution toward the end of this presentation, but we're not going to talk about that just yet because there's one more thing that we need to think about here. The economic impact analysis doesn't just work for ridership. We can also use this for capital projects. T4A asked us to study the economic impact of all of the IIJA grants that were awarded in 2024 in this summer session. And so we did. Our interns put in a huge amount of work to put all of this together for us. Max Polans wound up writing up one-page summaries for every single one of the IIJA projects that you can find on our website and distribution. Max, the other Max, I get them mixed up. Max Middleton helped Sean go through the entire law, page by page, finding all of the projects and deciding, is this a passenger rail project or a freight rail project or a transit project or something else? And Rivka Kadim helped me map out the geographic extent of all those projects so that we know which counties to include in our analysis. Here's a summary table for just a few of those projects grouped by region. The Northeast Corridor is getting a lot of money from IIJA, true enough, but that same benefit is going to the rest of the country. $3 billion for Brightline West, 3.3 for California High-Speed Rail, North Carolina and Virginia getting billions for their state-level investments to bring the Transforming Rail in Virginia initiative and the Southeast High-Speed Rail Corridor into fruition. The Gulf Coast number that you see there is not for the Mardi Gras, that's for the infrastructure required to get the Mardi Gras permanently in service. They have temporary platforms and shelters right now that they're using, and they want to build permanent stuff. So all of that coming together, you'll notice not just the economic impact is about 2 times the dollar value of the contract, but notice the number of jobs that are coming out as a result of this. A huge number of people are directly employed by each of these construction projects, but all those construction workers then spend that money they earn by buying groceries, by sending their kids to school, by healthcare expenses, by all the things that regular people spend money on in their local economies. That adds up to an additional thousands of jobs for every single one of these projects. And represented within those jobs are a dozen daycare workers in Shafter, California, supporting a grade separation project, are rural health workers in Dillwyn, Virginia, headquarters of the Buckingham branch that Virginia purchased as a result of the Transforming Rail Initiative Virginia project. It represents 2,000 homes being built in Mobile, Alabama to support the increase in population for the construction projects associated with the Gulf Coast Corridor. It represents the enormous amount of economic activity in Hornell, Illinois, being brought in for the Alstom plant as they have built the new Acela trains. It represents individual people. Sorry? Did I say something else? I've been up since 5 a.m. my time, excuse me. Hornell, New York. So all of that is huge, and it's being dispersed across the entire economy, and that's why it's so tragic that the administration is trying to withhold every single penny of this. The reason we did this project for T4A is not because these projects have an impact, but because the administration is trying to impound every single penny of it. Those daycare workers in Shafter, those healthcare workers in Virginia, those employees in Hornell, New York, are all significantly worse off before the train even runs because these projects are stalled. When you talk about impoundment as a term of jargon within the legal process and the congressional authorization and whatnot, people sort of glaze their eyes. What is that? It's theft. Russ Vaught knows just as much as every single one of you and I do what this impact is, because he has the exact same tools. It's not that he doesn't care, it's that he doesn't want you to have it and is prepared to use extrajudicial power to take it from you. Are you going to let that happen? And thus we mobilize. That's why this association exists. We can do the work to show what the impact of these initiatives is, the good it provides when they happen, and the good that is removed when they are blocked. We have the numbers and the data. We can make the case for y'all. That's why we're here, and that's why y'all are members of this association. To summarize the economic impact, passenger spending is a big deal, but it's not the only thing. It's the main thing. Something like 2 to 8 times more money goes to the economy of everywhere a new train runs, and both the passenger and the taxpayer saves money as a result of the train's existence. We don't need to be thinking about the national network and the Northeast Corridor as being in competition or one cross-subsidizes the other. They are integrated parts of an economically productive whole that serves the entire country. And all of that is supported by infrastructure projects that have a tangible impact in the communities where the service will one day be provided, even before that service opens. So this is what we want to organize around, but that's just part 2. The part that I actually got brought onto this project for is the environmental impact. And you might be wondering, at this point, why should we care? I hear you. We're in Texas. This is a big oil state. There's a lot of skepticism about environmentalism as a cause for political action. But we're scientists. I want to do an experiment with y'all, if you're willing here. I'm going to read a statement, and I want you to raise your hands if you think a majority of Americans believe it is true. Here's the statement. Our government should do more to address climate change. Do you believe a majority of Americans believe in that statement? This is a surprising answer to me, but still, only around like 50% of the room raised their hand, I think. I'd like everybody to close your eyes. Seriously, close your eyes. Thank you. I'd like you to raise your hand if you personally believe that statement is true. Everybody open your eyes. So you might be thinking, okay, there's a lot of folks in here who care about the environment. There's a lot of folks here who are interested in this kind of a process, but we're a biased sample. We understand the benefits of trains for the environment. We are already plugged into the space. What about the people who aren't plugged in yet? How do we convince them? The thing is, you don't need to. This has been data that's been come out from my colleagues in the geoscience information space, not the geoscience research, but people who study the information of geoscience as it propagated to the public. What you're looking at here are 2 figures from a key paper from 5 years ago, which found that there is overwhelming supermajority support in every US state for government climate action. It's not just that people recognize that there's a problem, it's that we want our public sector to do something about it. And yet, we don't think that people want that somehow. This is an even more important paper from 3 years ago. There's a technical term called, oh man, I forgot the term. I should have written it down. Systemic disbelief or something like that, where people assume that a position is less popular than it really is because they don't hear people talking about it. This is what happens when you are more plugged into your media sources, your radio, your television, your social media, than you are to your neighbors, because your neighbors want climate change solutions. This is not the misperception era for the generic idea of government action. This is the misperception era for the Green New Deal, asked by the pollster, policy item by policy item, from a carbon tax through to nationalization of public lands. Every single one of those items is equally supermajority popular, and yet most Americans believe that only 30% of their neighbors support it. That disconnect is huge, because as advocates, it means we can just talk about the issue, reminding people why they think it's important and speaking on their own terms without having to impose some kind of external hierarchy of what do we think. So let's talk about emissions for a bit. I'm a little bit long on time, so I'm going to try and make this quick. But you'll probably have seen a map like this one somewhere, especially if you're in the urbanist space. This is from one of these classic papers from about 12 years ago that everyone in the urbanism space loves to cite the maps for, but has not read the paper. It's a geography of per capita emissions by land area broken down by zip code. You'll notice in the bottom right-hand corner that Massachusetts shows up at the very bottom end, just above Cape Cod. There's a little blue circle of zip codes, that's Boston, because you have the ability to get around by transit and walking and biking in greater Boston. But as you go out into the Boston suburbs, you get really high per capita emissions as it becomes more and more necessary to drive everywhere. That's the classic argument in the urbanist discourse. But what's more interesting is what happens in the rural areas. Look at Maine, a state which does not have significantly, big cities. It has cities, but they're small cities. The little stretch of pink that you see there running up and down the spine is I-95. What we're talking about here is not merely population density. We're talking about proximity to automotive infrastructure. And we're talking about the ways that the electric grid interfaces with people's ability to keep their homes heated in the winter and cool in the summer. And all of these other variables that correlate directly with wealth concentration. Wealthier places are overwhelmingly the places with the highest per capita emissions, regardless of population characteristics. So for places like Maine, where you want to run a service that serves the local communities and doesn't just pour more money into the affluent suburbs of Boston, that's important because we can take a look at the electric grid and transportation emissions of a place like Maine and compare them to the US average. Maine has done a lot of work in the last few years to decarbonize its electric grid. And so it has a significantly smaller percentage of its total emissions coming from electric generation as compared to the US as a whole. But note that the consequence of that is that transportation constitutes nearly half of Maine's per capita emissions. That's a challenge for a state that is so reliant on cars with so little public transportation. It is also an opportunity for us to make the case that rural transportation by rail is a necessary component of getting us to a carbon-free future. So we have the argument all ready to go. The question is, how do we apply it? So this is a history lesson here. This is the US DOT data on passenger mile emissions for different transportation modes. This is the project that my student Cecilia was working on over the last spring semester. But she didn't do it alone. Mike Testman came in clutch in February at our RPA spring meeting in DC. Cecilia happened to be in our office. We were coordinating a project meeting, and Mike walks in and looks at what we're talking about, and he says, wait a minute, I think I got a couple studies, one from the FRA and one from the Department of Energy, that specifically quantified some of these emissions data in more recent terms. He sent that to us. And then Cecilia did the extra mile, went and found in the library database at GW every single paper that has cited those studies in the years since they were published. So we have additional points to look at on this chart. These represent not just the average of a given travel mode, but some of the extreme cases. You'll notice things like that little purple triangle right up there above 2020 is short haul flights between low population centers that aren't full, with low efficiency turbine engines on small jets. Really high emissions per capita. In the same year, noticing that there's several different points that are blue squares for different train systems. Those represent trains on different electric grids with different degrees of carbon-free generation capacity. You can get to nearly zero on the Swiss electric grid if you are running trains in Switzerland. We don't have a Swiss electric grid and we don't run trains in Switzerland. So we're going to have to be stuck with the US DOT average. But we can at the very least contextualize this US DOT average data for a given locality and say how much of the emission situation you're dealing with is proportional to the national average. We can tailor the analysis to the local community of interest. So then what do we do with it? Well, this is where we have to think about the economic impact of carbon emissions. You'll see this referred to in the literature as the social cost of carbon, SCC. This idea has been around since the late 70s, and there have been a huge number of people trying to quantify it in a couple different ways. Yep, this finally went down. Joe, could you advance, please? Thank you. So there's two ways to think about the social cost of carbon. The first is as the climate warms, you have an increase in natural disasters. There are more powerful hurricanes, more powerful tornadoes, more frequent forest fires, etc. Each of those disasters then imposes an economic burden on the community that it hits, not just in terms of the property damage caused by the storm, but also because of the transactions that don't occur because people either are anticipating or fleeing the storm before it occurs. Those costs add up, and you can just add them up. You can construct an economic model, and Joe, if you could advance. Thank you. In fact, could you just hit play 2 more times, please? Thank you. So you can think about the total cost of the damage that a given amount of CO2 in the atmosphere will create through more extreme weather. You can also think about it the other way. If you were to put a price on carbon emissions, how might that change the incentives from emitters that might cause them to invest in mitigation strategies to keep carbon emissions low? So at that point, the question becomes, what is the minimum price that you'd expect to pay to incentivize decarbonizing behavior in the economy? How do you calculate that, though? It's complicated. Another flow chart. We're going to worry about this in more detail offline. Ask me about it later. That is far too long conversation, and I am at 8 minutes till the hour. But the key idea at the very bottom here, you'll see this cell at the bottom of the flowchart called discounting rate. That essentially is asking the question of when do you care about the damage happening? Do you care about it within the lifetime of an engineering project, or do you care about it for the residence time of that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? And there are several other questions of the same category that you might think about. not just when the damage occurs, but also how permanent that damage is. If the ice sheet melts and you cannot get it back, does that impose a greater or lesser burden on the climate as compared to if you can rebuild the ice sheet later by removing carbon from the atmosphere? And then similarly, how disproportionate is the impact on places that are least equipped to deal with it? If all of the damage is occurring in relatively well-off places with enough money and resources to repair the damage, that's different than if every single climate impact happens in Bangladesh. If you care about that difference, then all of those questions, if you answer them towards the more long-term thinking answer, will make the social cost of carbon value go up. Applying that, you get this principle called the reward of the farsighted. I'm borrowing that phrase from this paper by Cerasoli and Porporato from 2 years ago. They calculated what the social cost of carbon ought to be to change behavior of emitters. And their finding is that at $100 per ton is the minimum required to keep atmospheric CO2 below 400 parts per million in the year 2200. That, or excuse me, 2100. We're still in 21st century. That is significantly below current emissions. We passed 450 ppm a while back, and we're probably not going to go back there unless we take this seriously and start to really put the brakes on this. But that's not the highest value that exists in the literature. You'll see estimates of $2,000 per ton out there among people who want to calculate the total damage of all of that CO2. And what's notable is that over the last decade, the literature reviews consistently show that increases in CO2 costs are progressive. We are 10 times higher estimates now in 2025 than we had in 2015, and the same was true from 2015 to 2005. Policy, meanwhile, severely lags all of this. The United States does not have a social cost of carbon policy. The previous administration recommended a price of $57 per ton not to be charged to emitters, but for infrastructure planners to calculate when evaluating the benefits of their proposals. But no one is charging any emitters that dollar value. Where it comes in, though, is that we can now use it and say, how much do you care about the climate? If you care enough to think about a $2,000 per ton SCC value, then you can extrapolate on a linear basis how many trips shifting from other modes to rail and the resulting decrease in emissions will save you money in the long run over the time frame that CO2 exists in the atmosphere or over the time frame that your project for building a new train will continue. These are the same figures that you saw in the previous history slide with slight benefits for electric trains as opposed to diesel. There are some caveats here about Amtrak's fleet replacement resulting in much, much lower emissions than the old Genesis units. This is a very good thing. We need to keep it going. At the same time, though, there's a lot of regional variation, so it's important to think about this in the local context. We have a linear scaling factor that results basically because we're multiplying a set number by a linear, cost. So if you're thinking about the previous recommendation, less than 1% of the total economic impact of a given rail project is going to come from reduced emissions. But that keeps going up as you think about higher SCC values. At that $100 per ton that Cerasoli and Porporato proposed, we're talking about 1.5% of the total economic impact resulting from emissions reduction. If you go then to the higher values, you're talking about a third. If you care to think about the lifetime of the carbon in the atmosphere that your train is going to emit or that your car is going to emit or what have you, then you need to be thinking about the benefits of rail as being 30% greater than the previous slides had shown. Add another factor of 0.3 on top of whatever you think the benefit of rail is when you think about climate. Here's how that shakes out for the main group. We didn't want to say we recommend a specific SSC value because we're not climate scientists at the RPA. That is assessment that they can make themselves by consulting the climate policy experts. But what we can say is if they care a certain amount, if they can put a dollar value on how much they think the carbon emissions are worth, then here is the number they will get out of it. And at the high end, we're talking about an additional $9 million of statewide savings over the lifetime of the project as a result of the investment. So, how do you figure all of that? What do we do about all of this? Remember, it doesn't take much. People already think this is important. You just have to remind them about it and think about it on the terms they care about. We have to be sensible at how we advocate this position, but we also have to be optimistic, not supposing that this is something that we can shy away from just because we assume people don't believe it. The greatest environmental impact from rail is associated with mode shift. You don't have to electrify the train for the environmental impact to be significant. Just getting people to move from car trips to train trips is a huge boon for the environmental impact of our transportation system. And even then, even if you don't want to electrify right away, please understand that electrification is what gets us to the finish line. And as you're advocating, have that in the back of your mind that if you want to really get to the finish line, at some point in the back of your mind, have a plan for electrification of whatever you're proposing ready to deploy, having thought about it a little bit. So what are you supposed to do with all this data? Let's go out and use it. There's some recommendations on the next couple slides of how we might go about doing this, but basically RPA fills a niche. We are rail experts. We are right size for the advocacy setting at the early stages. You don't need to go to McKinsey or a rail specialist consulting firm to get this kind of information. We'll do it for you. And if you want to help us find more customers, we have some recommendations for how to do it. But the short version is that this is not something that fits within the traditional donation model of our association. We need to be thinking about making connections with groups that need data services like this one, rather than just continuing to support our operations internally. We want to partner with every person who has ever suggested anything about a new route proposal and give them the data they need to get that proposal off the ground. That's going to take all of us working together on this. If you have friends out there in the world who are not in RPA, you can maybe bring them into RPA. That'd be great. But we also want to hear from them about what their needs are so that we can work together with them. So we can use your help, and we'd love to have it. For those of you who have helped already, I want to say thank you at the very end. And for everyone else, thank you for your attention.